Welcome to Books on Air, the podcast that tells the story behind the book. It includes insights from authors about how they compose their work, what inspires them, and what they hope you'll take away from their book. Here's your host for this episode of Books on Air, Suzanne Harris.
Welcome to the Books on Air podcast. I'm Sloan Fremont, filling in for Suzanne Harris. This is the podcast where listeners get the secret story behind every book. Joining me today is Dr. Marnix Wells, author of the book Héguanzî, the Dao of Unity, linking politics, philosophy, and religion in ancient China. How did a young boy growing up in exile become China's first Augustan emperor? Well, today we're going to find out. So Marnix, I want to welcome you to the Books on Air podcast.
Okay, thank you, Sloan. Good to speak with you.
Yeah, so let's start out by telling the audience just a little bit about yourself and what led you to write your book.
Right. Well, I've always had a kind of fascination for China and discovering the unknown. And so I ended up doing Chinese at Oxford. My first choice had been archaeology, but my father warned me off, saying there was no money in it. I think he expected me to go in the diplomatic corps. So he was happy with Chinese as my choice, and as it happened, I did end up working in the Far East. At that time, it was the Mao's Cultural Revolution, so I couldn't get into mainland China. So I went to Hong Kong, and then Taiwan, and Japan, and eventually South Korea. But most of the time was probably Taiwan. And that was my most direct contact with Chinese culture until later I could go to the mainland and check out some of the places. So that's in a nutshell, my experience of China.
Interesting. So how long did you live there in that area?
I was over 10 years altogether in Taiwan and about the same in South Korea. I was working as a manager in a container shipping company, or companies, I should say. And it was pretty much booming at that time, the export trade. And so I was able to, make a bit of money and at the same time pursue my interest in Chinese culture and everything from Tai Chi to Chinese music and opera, and so I even married a Taiwanese and have a daughter who's now a medical doctor.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah. So you were there, definitely in the culture, understood it. And so tell us about how let's talk about the book a little bit. Can you set the scene for us? Tell us about a little bit of a background on the story.
Yeah. Well, I was attracted by the kind of spiritual nature of Taoism and the writings of Laozi. And as a kind of also someone interested in history and battles and the military. My father was an Air Force pilot in the Second World War. And so I had a problem, how does this, peaceful, gentle religion, how does it sort of equate with the real world? How does it deal with politics and the art of war, for example? So I discovered this book by Héguanzî, which it seems was influenced by Laozi because he quotes him several times. But at the same time, he has a kind of down to earth outlook about how to solve the world problems, which at that time was perhaps not similar to today or our recent history, in the sense that there were there were a lot of warring kingdoms, and he was actually, the writer, I think, was in the middle, judging from what he says of himself. He was actually facing an invasion from the kingdom of Qin, which Qin was the one which was very shortly to unify China by conquering the other kingdoms. And it is thought that the name China actually comes from Qin, which was the westernmost kingdom, and they were very formidable on the battlefield and also quite ruthless in their methods. So this is the background as I see it. And he also has a kind of utopian vision of a kind of Messiah, which is something which was not detected in Chinese history at that time, so far as I can see. So his work had been kind of sidelined because there were questions about whether it was really authentic. But this was kind of exploded when they discovered new manuscripts from the tombs about 2,000 years ago. People had been buried sort of 2,200 years ago. And so they kind of corroborated the authenticity of Héguanzî. And yet, although there have been academic studies of the work, nobody had translated it. So I felt, we have to get it into English, difficult as that may be. So I charged in, and this book is the result.
Mm-hmm. Well, and for those who maybe aren't familiar with Taoism, can you explain that, the philosophy?
Yeah. Laozi, who is presumed the author, although nothing is really known for sure, somewhere around 300 plus BC, he wrote this book, which is called the Dao de Jing, which is the way and virtue. Now, the way is my translation, or the common translation of the Dao, which is the way of nature, really. And he looked to water as the kind of ideal substance because it is so vital to life and so adaptable, and yet it is so soft, but it can conquer the hardest substance over time, like it can wear away hard stone. And so this is the kind of the model which he held up for us in our daily lives, that we should think about using softness rather than hardness, because hardness will break, but softness can adapt and accommodate to different situations. And so that was his ideal. But he never mentions any person by name or any place or even any time. So he's a bit of a mystery man. The Héguanzî, on the other hand, although we don't know anything from other sources, but from his own work, he does mention, say, the kingdom of Zhao, which was in confrontation with Qin, and he mentions the name of certain kings, so we can pretty much place him in time and place, which is helpful to understand the background.
So this process of the translation and what you went through, how long did it take you to write your book?
Well, that's, in a sense, so you could say half my life has been working towards it. My thesis was about 22 years ago, and that sort of fed into it. I studied the idea of dynamics, which is a kind of a potential force which underlies everything. And in a sense, that's what the Taoists tend to tend to sort of try to do. In other words, you adapt to the forces which are already there. You tap into them, much as I suppose science does to create energy, because actually they don't create energy so much, tap into nature's energies.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And of course that's what we can do in our life, of course, rather than charging into situations. If we listen and learn, then we can usually do better, and work with people and with situations, rather than try to create everything as if we were kind of gods ourselves.
Right. Well, and in that, often we try in that resistance, right? We don't like something, or we don't want something, so we might push against it or reject it in some way. And the energy it takes to do that, and the mental toll and the physical toll it takes on a person, versus what you're saying, that approach of that softness or that gentleness, is such a more peaceful and easier way to live.
That's right. I mean, it doesn't mean that we have to accept everything,
right?
But so it's not a cop out. We have to work, but we at the same time we have to be smart with our methods, not try to impose, but rather to adapt and make use of what is already there, or what we can tap into.
Right. Yes, and that reminder of it not, going along with something doesn't mean we give up and just, we're not, taking responsibility for ourselves. It's a different way, a different approach.
Exactly.
Anyway.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so in this process of the translation and even having the experiences you've had in all those different countries, did anything surprise you during the process?
Well, I discovered that although Qin was kind of seemed to be the enemy, I think ultimately that the Qin, which founded the Chinese Empire, was basically, in some sense, tapping into Héguanzî, because he has this kind of vision of all nations and races and coming together. And although it wasn't done peacefully, as it turned out, nonetheless, they did adopt this idea of sort of centralized unity, which China has enjoyed in some way for 2,000 years. So, while Europe was fragmented, the Chinese have had this example of, although they have had some gaps where they were conquered or they had civil wars, but nonetheless they have kept going as a kind of empire, or a kind of state, for the last 2,000 years, centered in one nation. And so that's it's a good lesson for the world. At the same time, it's also kind of something we need to be careful about, because it's also a potential threat to the rest of us, unless we can somehow work things out. So it cuts both ways.
Right. Yeah, and this is such a fascinating topic, and so much to it. But we're coming up on the end of our time. So just a couple more questions before we wrap up. Who would you say your book would appeal to, and why?
Well, I'm hoping that it can appeal to both the kind of scholars and the general interest, because I think it's, although I've tried to make it as academically respectable as possible, giving references, and also been quite sort of conservative in my translation rather maybe too literal. But at the same time, I think it is something which concerns everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of unity, not only in the spiritual realm, but also in the world today, seems to be such a vital topic.
Yeah.
So, hopefully it's for everyone. But I realize that it may not appeal to all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that spiritual side that you just touched on there, I mean, it's very easy to look out into the world and want the world to change, but not wanting to do anything within ourselves. And
True.
it sounds like a lot of what you're touching on here is encouraging people to look at that, what's going on within.
Yeah, indeed. I think there's lots of people doing that. At the same time, we need to look out. We need to, learn more about the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we need to know more about China and its culture, not from the propaganda so much as from the actual history.
Right.
And also into, Asia, Africa, South America. We mustn't shut ourselves away in our Western paradise, or
mm-hmm.
not so paradise. But we must engage with the world, and what's going on in Bali right now may be a good start.
Yeah. And again, like I said, such a fascinating topic. And Dr. Marnix Wells, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Before we close,
great questions. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you. Yes. And before we close out, what do you hope the readers learn or take away after reading your book?
Well, thinking about unity, as I say, in different ways, both from the point of view of nature, environment, and also, as I say, the politics of the world, how we can understand the other people, and hopefully, not go to war, mm-hmm. if it's possible to avoid it. But at the same time, we have to maintain our principles, and I think Héguanzî shows that.
Yeah. Well, again, I want to thank you, Dr. Marnix Wells, for joining us today. It's been amazing to talk to you.
Okay, many thanks. Take care.
You can find more about the book, Héguanzî, the Dao of Unity, Linking Politics, Philosophy, and Religion in Ancient China on Amazon, and I'll link to the book in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. You've been listening to the Books on Air podcast, brought to you on webtalkradio.net. You can also hear this podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. I'm Sloan Fremont, and I hope you'll join us for the next Books on Air podcast. Remember, you never know who's going to be here, and you never know what we're going to talk about. Thank you so much for listening.